10 players to stash before week 11 kicks off. We're closing in on 1,200 subscribers, and any support is greatly appreciated. First guy up is Luther Burden. So he had a 49% snap share last week, which was the highest mark of the year for him. And on the season, he has 22% targets per route run and 2.7 yards per route run. And I know yards per route run can feel a little bit overplayed, but he's only behind Jaxon and Puka in that category for guys that have ran more than 75 routes. And, when you talk about underlying metrics, when you're trying to identify a breakout, like this is it. Now we have Ben Johnson saying, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, like he's starting to get more targets. The trust level between he and Caleb is growing, and he's been very productive when he's gotten the ball. And there's a strong argument to be made that he should get, more targets heading his way. It's no secret that Olamide Zaccheaus has been the extra wide receiver fantasy managers did not ask for this season, but he's coming off about as brutal game as you can imagine. He dropped 3 of his 4 targets, and I think we know what he is at this point, and it's time to get Burden more involved. And
I agree. I think it's time as well. And I love how you picked the minimum of 75 routes because Luther Burden has 83 routes run or something like that, compared to the 2 guys ahead of him that have like 275. So obviously Jaxon's absolutely running away in that category, but it is a complete shock to see Luther Burden as high as he is. I know he had that 65-yard touchdown catch earlier in the year. That's kind of driving that number quite a bit, but the more he can get on the field, the more he can earn targets. And I just really think he might be the second best receiver on the team. And obviously we've liked DJ Moore in the past, but I agree here that I would love to see Luther Burden have a second half breakout. And if that starts this week against Minnesota, it's going to be hard to put that genie back in the bottle against Pittsburgh, Philly, and Green Bay. That is a really critical part of their schedule. And if they get Burden going against Minnesota first and then kind of have him as an ace in the hole downfield threat, a little bit more routes run throughout the rest of the season, and especially during that stretch, I think that is going to be good for Chicago too. So get Luther Burden on your teams if you can. Try and trade from in Dynasty now if you can.
Jayden Higgins. So like a lot of you, I had this beautiful vision that we'd get Nico and Higgins on the outside with Jalen Knoll occupying the slot all season. And unfortunately, that has not been the case. So while Kirk has been more or less the roadblock for Knoll, it's been Xavier Hutchinson taking most of the playing time away from Higgins. But outside of that fluky 2-touchdown game on 3 targets, Hutchinson has pretty much done nothing this entire season. He has 1 game over more than 30 yards. And this past week, when Davis Mills threw the ball 45 times, Hutch didn't have a catch, and Higgins had the best game of his career, 5 catches on 7 targets for 42 yards and a score. Now, I don't want to get too over my skis with Higgins because the Texans' passing attack has been a disappointment all season, and this is more for our deeper league audience, but he is worth a stash to see if this role continues to increase. And at this point, it's very unlikely that Houston makes the playoffs. ESPN Predictor has them at 18% chance, which feels pretty high considering the Chiefs and Ravens are still on the outside looking in. And so if we get a kind of let the kids play and see what they have mentality from the Texans, you could see some nice volume from Higgins to close out the season. And this is a player that you and I really liked in the pre-draft process. And, maybe we took him a little bit too much in our best ball drafts, but it's in the best interest of the Texans to see what they have from their rookie wide receivers as they look to 2026.
Yeah, and I was just so hoping that the role was going to be way better than this early in the year, because if he just had the role, even that wasn't producing, I'd feel a lot better about him. But there's also something to be said about that if the role was there, he'd be way higher rostered, even if he wasn't producing. So this is maybe a turning point in this game. He's got more than 7 targets in 2 of his last 3 games. And if he does stay on the field 70-ish% of the snaps, which I know he hasn't really gotten to at this point, I think that, we could see a second half breakout here. And Tennessee is an excellent matchup to try and do that against, right? I mean, they do play in some low scoring games, but it's a very gettable team through the air. And so I just really hope that we see, like you said, the role with the targets, but I hope to see that 57% snap share jump into the 70s, and then I'll have a lot more confidence in him. But you do want to try and beat that by a week. If he doesn't do anything, he's still down in 50%. You can always cut him going into next week. And then, get your roster set up and re-add him before his week 12 matchup. But I do still really believe in the talent here for Jayden Higgins. One of those prospects that always was going to take a little bit more time than some of the other guys, big bodied outside wide receiver. We saw it with Keon Coleman. He's still trying to work into a big role. And so, maybe it doesn't happen as a rookie, but this week, coming off his best game, I think is as good of a shot as as he could build on going into the rest of the season.
Next, I have Michael Wilson. So this one is a little bit unique as a stash because he's going to be started in a lot of leagues this week, but wanted to include him on here because we don't exactly know how long Marvin Harrison will be out. And the tone I kind of gathered from the reporting was that it could be more than one game, but who knows? And the Cardinals also lost Zay Jones to a torn Achilles. So McBride this week might see 20 targets and Wilson should fairly easily get 8+. And, it's not like he's some practice squad guy that we're trying to project, right? Like he had 7 targets last week on 92% of the snaps, and Marv obviously played in that one. So, this is more of a potential plug and play and stash, for the short term. But looking at week 12, if Marv isn't back, they get the Jaguars, who can't really stop anyone on defense right now. And, Davis Mills, who I mentioned before, just threw for almost 300 yards against them. And, Brissett has been playing at a very solid level. And so, looking at week 12 specifically, there are 4 teams on bye: Broncos, Dolphins, Chargers, and Commanders. And that's 7 top 24 wide receivers. So you're likely going to be having to look for some replacements that week.
Yeah, and I think Michael Wilson's just an underrated player in general, but he gets buried on this depth chart because there's so many targets going to McBride and to Marv. And the fact that Marv is going to be out now, we're definitely going to see him at the top of waiver wire columns going into week 12 against Jacksonville if he goes off in this game. So this is somebody that if you're looking forward and you have, like you mentioned with the bye weeks, right? You got the Broncos and you got Charger wide receivers. This is a perfect guy to try and put on the end of your bench just for that 1 week in particular that you can plug and play. And I think that he might just be in an absolute smash spot coming off of 2 strong games, because if he builds off of this 92% snap share and 7 targets that he got last week against the Seattle defense, that's very good. San Francisco's as beat up as any team can possibly be. We've talked about that in the past. I really think that this is somebody that's great for week 12. So look at your team, make sure you're planning ahead, and get Michael Wilson on the end of your bench. Next guy up is Adonai Mitchell. So he's just been one of my favorites since we started scouting him 2 years ago. And I was very thankful that you let me put him on here, despite the fact that he has done nothing. And it's really been a disappointing start to his career with Indianapolis. But mainly, he just couldn't get on the field. And so that's going to be very different, I think, coming into this game with the Jets, right? Garrett Wilson's out for 3 to 4 weeks, and Adonai Mitchell has a chance here to step in and be the number 1 outside receiver starting from his very first game here against New England. So do I think he's going to go nuts? No, because the passing game for the Jets, it's no surprise that Justin Fields has completely fallen apart as a passer. And so if Justin Fields even gets to 100 yards, I think that would be a surprise. But overall, I think for Adonai Mitchell, what we're looking for is a 70, in that 70% snap share, because if he's going to be featured in that way in terms of playing time, I think that he's going to be useful down the stretch, whether or not, they turn to Tyrod Taylor, or if Justin Fields just is able to kind of figure it out and get over that 146 yards per game that they've been averaging so far through the air. And in games that they do, it's going to be because of Adonai Mitchell down the field making plays. So I really am happy that he got traded away from Indy.
Yeah, this is someone that I would be trying to trade for actively in Dynasty, assuming the Jets bring in, a quarterback next offseason, whether that's via trade or via the draft. It's not going to be Fields. So this is, again, we've talked about Adonai Mitchell over the last couple of years at nauseum. This is not the type of prospect that you want to take lightly. He just moves different than most players out there. He's just a absolutely phenomenal athlete, and we saw some flashes with the Colts. Unfortunately, it was kind of that bonehead drop touchdown that really was the nail in the coffin for him. And I do tip my cap to the Colts for just cutting bait, and he wasn't part of their long-term plan, and it looks like Alec Pierce is probably going to be. So they did right by him, and I'm very excited, because even when Garrett Wilson comes back, and we're not saying that you're going to be starting Adonai Mitchell for the fantasy football playoffs, but their number 2 wide receiver has been non-existent. Like it's been Tyler Johnson, who has 10 catches on the year, which is just kind of an embarrassment as an NFL organization. But you get the idea long term that, we love this play, and, has a chance for some runway here in the coming weeks.
Next wide receiver up, and the last wide receiver we're going to talk about for this week is Tyler Lockett. Talk about a guy I did not expect to be talking about whatsoever. Yeah, just wild to think that he went through the first part of the year with Tennessee and just wasn't being productive at all. And that's obviously a little bit to do with the team. But then he comes out and he plays 57% of the snaps in his first game with the Raiders. And he goes 6 targets, 5 catches, leads the team in receiving with 44 yards. Although that's not exciting, it just does feel like a role that maybe he's going to step into. I mean, they did just trade Jacoby Myers, and if he's going to be the number 2 or even the number 3 in the slot and be kind of the safety blanket, there's a chance here that he can be somewhat viable. Now, do I think he's got any sort of explosion left? No, not really. He's 33, but there's definitely a case to be made that he goes off here against Dallas, and you'll see him on waiver wires going into the matchup with Cleveland. Now, is there going to be a chance for like 10% fab? No, like nobody's going to be suggesting that. But I do think that if you're stuck again this week, even, that you could take a deep shot on Lockett and possibly be rewarded.
Yeah, this felt like one of those where Gino tapped the GM on the shoulder and just said, hey, Besh and Thornton aren't ready yet. They're not in the right spots. I'm kind of treading water over here. I just want a guy that I'm familiar with, and I respect them for, bringing over the veteran because, he wasn't doing anything for the Titans. But again, this team is kind of a dumpster fire. So if you're in a very, very deep PPR league, you could do worse than a veteran presence. But again, this one isn't quite as fun as some of the other names we mentioned earlier.
Moving over to running back, we've got one name for you this week, and that is Blake Corum. So he's only 21% rostered, which I thought was a little bit surprising based on his usage over the last 3 weeks. So he had 12 carries before their bye, and then 13 carries in both games after the bye, which no receiving game work really, but it does feel like that's a shift in role in a way that we haven't seen in the Kyren Williams era, really. So I think he is probably at this point the highest value handcuff that you can get for free on the waiver wire. And if you're a Kyren owner, at the very least, you should be having him on your bench at this point. I know we've said that before about Blake Corum, and that has just turned out to be a nothing burger. But seeing as much ground game work as he's getting, I think at this point it's important to get him. And if you have a roster spot, you need running back help, throw him on the end of your bench because he can have a little bit of standalone value. And also, if anything were to happen to Kyren, you've got a starter on your hands here.
Yeah, and we typically try to avoid just like pure handcuffs on this type of episode, but this is one that's just so glaring that it just kind of needs to be said. And maybe next week we'll look at doing like a highest value handcuffs for rest of season. But like you said, 13 touches the last 3 weeks. Second round pick. He's looked good. Jarquez Hunter has been nowhere to be found this year. I know he was kind of everyone's favorite darling in the offseason and making excuses as to why Kyren is going to be taken over. And of course, Kyren has once again just been awesome. So this isn't a take that he's going to take over Kyren's role, but you cannot ignore the touches and the potential handcuff value with Corum.
Yeah, and Kyren is just the easiest call every single year in the preseason, or he has been for the last couple of years. Just like, oh, how about let's take the guy that's really good and scores a lot of touchdowns on a good offense and plays 80% of the snaps. How about let's go with that guy, as a top 10 running back.
Next guy up at the tight end position, Brenton Strange. So his practice window is open and he has a chance to play this week, but even if he doesn't, you can leave him in your IR spot. And we had Strange on this episode either after week 1 or 2, and that was kind of looking like a good call. 7 targets in back-to-back games before getting injured week 5. And this is a little bit of a Mickey Mouse stat, but I'm going to give it to you anyways. Jags have won 5 games this season, and Strange has played in 4 of those. And, he's got some decent matchups down the stretch. Indy twice, who give up the 6th most fantasy points per game to tight ends. He's got the Titans. He's got the Jets. Now, no one is going to be licking their chops to start Brenton Strange down the stretch, with their season on the line. But in a deep league, if you're in a pinch at the position, can stash and see if he gets back into that 7 targets per game range. And for what it's worth, he's a solid player and, a guy that you and I have liked now for a couple of years.
Yeah, I like the Brenton Strange call for sure. I just feel like there's so many tight ends that are available currently out there that are decently productive, and Strange maybe kind of fits into that role even once he's healthy. So if you have the IR spot, I can understand it. And like you said with Jacksonville, they definitely could use the help and use weapons, and he was productive when he was on the field, and obviously a great player overall, 2nd round pick. So I do think that there's some value here with Strange. And if you look ahead a little bit to the playoffs, he's gets that Jets matchup in week 15. So if you lost Tucker Kraft, for example, or you really need somebody you've been trying to rely on, Colston Loveland, after his breakout game, and that didn't really work out in the next game. This is somebody that I think is worth adding and throwing on your IR spot, especially if you have one open.
For the defenses, we've got the Baltimore Ravens. They're going up against Cleveland this week, and they've got the Jets in week 12. So this is a defense overall that's been trending up. They've gotten healthier. They made a couple trades at the deadline and are currently on a 3-game win streak, which should grow the next couple weeks facing the Browns and the Jets. And I like them as a stash for next week because you don't have to clog a roster spot. You can just start them this week against the Browns. And then, like I said, next week you get to face the Jets, which both are fairly self-explanatory.
Yeah, and you're cheating a little bit picking a defense that's 79% owned. But I will say that they are 30th amongst 32 teams in fantasy points this year. So seeing them that highly rostered is kind of surprising, but they did have a pretty good start to the schedule in week 9, and having Lamar back and getting a ton of their defensive players healthy now, I think everybody's following that narrative and knows that Baltimore is actually a good defense. So the two matchups can't get better. Against Cincinnati, maybe you don't play them, but then it's Pittsburgh in week 14 before the fantasy playoffs. So they do have an excellent schedule looking forward over the next month as well. So really like Baltimore. If they're still out there in your leagues, they're a must-have.
Yeah, and I will say too, with some of these like legacy great defenses, sometimes in non-competitive leagues, they'll be way more rostered than you would expect. Like you'll see like the Steelers, like 85% in like ESPN office leagues and things like that. So just be on the lookout. But again, I think they got added a ton. Just wanted to make sure to call them out because you can play them 2 weeks in a row.
Next defense I want to highlight is one that should be completely widely available because they are absolutely not playable this week against Dallas, is the Raiders defense. So they're 4% owned. This is purely a stash for the following week in the matchup against Cleveland. So Dylan Gabriel did show out a little bit better in week 10, didn't turn the ball over and had 2 touchdowns, but I think that was mainly the matchup he had. And so I do think against the Raiders, who can get after the quarterback, right? They still have Max Crosby. So against Cleveland, I think maybe Gabriel decides to hold the ball a little bit too much, and they can maybe have 3 sacks in that game, hold them down in the teens in terms of points scored, hold them below 300 yards. I think that's all kind of reasonable to expect just based on the offense they're playing. And so I do like the Raiders. And week 12, again, multiple teams on bye. It's a really, really bad week for defenses. So getting ahead of it with somebody like the Raiders, if you're in a competitive league, I think is worth it.
Yeah, and Gabriel's taken 17 sacks in 5 games, including 6 sacks last week against the Jets. And the Raiders may not have a ton to play for, but I promise you Max Crosby will be trying to tee off on Gabriel. And if it is Shedeur, by that point, Shedeur led the NCAA in sacks taken last season. So there you go.
Yeah, a little foreshadowing there. I like that.
Yeah, there you go.
And the last defense we're going to talk about here is the 49ers. And so this one is tough because they're so banged up. So I don't know if they're going to be able to stop anybody. But they do get Carolina in week 12. And Carolina hasn't been playing as great on offense. They still have been winning some games, which is honestly incredible with how little they've been scoring. But Tet has the hamstring injury, has been a little bit banged up. And Rico Dowdle has just been unbelievably good on the ground. So maybe he just gets it going against the 49ers and rushes for 150 yards again. But I don't know that that's going to be the case. I don't think the 49ers are just going to kind of roll over and let him just dominate. And so that's kind of why I think the Carolina matchup is good. And again, in week 12, the defenses are so bad that I just wanted to highlight another defense that's out there in a lot of leagues.
Salah's a smart guy, right? Load the box against Dowdle, double team Tet, and just say, hey, you can try to beat us that way. Give us your best shot. Last player here for our Superflex audience. I alluded to him before, but it is Shedeur Sanders, and I included him on this episode last week. And I will say Gabriel did throw for 2 touchdowns last week, but that was against the Jets, and he only threw for 160 yards in a game in which they were trailing and lost. And we know Kevin Stefanski handed over the play calling duties to Tommy Rees, which I've alluded to before, but was probably an ownership decision, which sounds like, maybe the Shedeur would be an ownership decision as well, because we know Stefanski does not want to hand things over to him. But, Shedeur as a prospect was obviously very polarizing, and we all enjoyed watching Mel Kiper lose his mind during the draft, but he's a better talent than a 5th round pick. Like, I think we all know that. And I think it's also very clear to everyone that Gabriel isn't the long-term answer at quarterback. So it makes sense for the Browns to kind of follow a similar blueprint to the Saints and see what they've got. Now, do I think either of these quarterbacks will be starting next year for the Browns? Probably not. but I think it is worth a shot and just kind of see what they have.
Yeah, and I think it's tough with Gabriel because that was the quarterback that they wanted in this draft. They ended up getting him, and then ownership made them draft Shedeur, and so there's this weird thing between the GM and the coaching staff and the ownership group at the quarterback position. That's the last thing that you want organizationally. But I think because of that fact as well, that they're going to at least give him a chance at some point during the year. And you look down the schedule a little bit, you get San Francisco, who's banged up. You get Tennessee, not a good defense. Chicago, not a good defense. Buffalo, they're okay against the pass, but still they have not been a very good defense. And then Pittsburgh in the championship. Now, if you're starting Shedeur Sanders, the chances that you're in the championship are pretty low. But, if he does get a shot, maybe he helps you get there through a week 14 bye or something like that. And so if you have a roster spot and you don't have quarterback capped limits on your rosters, Shedeur is definitely a solid stash because I think he should be starting here in the next 3 weeks or so.
And we'll beat the drum that this is why Superflex is the best, because we're having conversations like this. We're not just picking up Jordan Love off the wire. So that's
100%. Yeah. I can't even fathom playing in a league that's not Superflex. It's just like, it's so much different. It's not even kind of the same or nearly as fun.
Right.
All right. With that, thank you guys so much for watching. If you're still here, hit that like, hit that subscribe button, and we'll talk to you in the next one.